In 1930, the Arctic gave back a camera, a diary, and 3 dead men. The photographs looked like proof. They were not enough. On White Island, the search party did not find an explanation waiting in the snow. It found objects, diaries, equipment, photographic film, the last camp of an expedition that had vanished 33 years earlier. The images seemed to answer the oldest question. The men had not disappeared in a single blank instant. They had landed. They had worked. They had hauled supplies across the ice. They had kept making a record after the balloon was gone. But the photographs also made the case harder. If Andrée, Strindberg, and Frankel survived the landing, then the disaster was not simply a fall from the sky. It was slower than that. A balloon losing lift, a march losing direction, a moving sheet of ice carrying men away from the route they were trying to walk. The film survived what they did not. It could show posture, distance, loads, weather, and order. Weather. It could show that the final journey still had discipline. It could not show the last decision. It could not show the final sequence of death. It could not turn a recovered image into a verdict. For 33 years, the outside world had almost nothing. One message survived early. On 13th of July, 1897, a pigeon message from the expedition reported good progress toward the north. All was well on board. Then the record stopped. No return, no rescue, no confirmed wreckage, no diary in hand, no developed film. The men crossed from news into rumor, and from rumor into national memory before the evidence was available to correct the story. That is how a missing expedition becomes easy to use. One version can make it a story of scientific confidence, another can make it a story of arrogance, another can make it a national symbol. Each version can begin before the ice has given back the facts. André's expedition belonged to a late 19th century world that believed machines could shorten the polar problem. Ships were slow, sledges were brutal. The pack ice broke, compressed, opened, and drifted. Andrée proposed a different answer. Go over it. The balloon was called Ornen. It was a hydrogen balloon, lifted by hydrogen gas rather than hot air. It would rise from Danes Island in northwestern Svalbard and ride the wind across the Arctic toward the North Pole. In André's mind, this was not a stunt. It was an argument made of fabric, gas, rope, instruments, food, cameras, and calculation. Engineering would do what endurance alone had not done. It would cross the polar sea from above. The crew was small. Salomon August Andrée was a Swedish engineer. Knut Frankel was a civil engineer. Niels Strindberg was a physicist and photographer. 3 men, 1 balloon, and a plan that could only work if the air behaved closely enough to what the plan required. That last condition was everything. Strindberg's camera was not an accessory. It was part of the expedition's claim on the future. If the men reached the pole or crossed the Arctic, the photographs would help prove where they had gone and what they had done. If they failed, the same camera might become something else. The Library of Congress catalog later credited Strindberg as the photographer of recovered expedition prints and noted that the film was recovered in 1930. The man behind the images carried a record into a place where no outside witness followed. There was also someone waiting beyond the expedition. Lachambre and Machuron, writing in 1898 from inside the support expedition, remembered Strindberg asking that proofs of his last photographs be sent to his fiancée, Anna Charlier. They also remembered him giving them a final letter for her. That detail comes through witnesses close to the expedition, writing after the disappearance in a period already full of public feeling. It still matters. Before the camera became evidence, it was also meant to carry images home. The men waited nearly 2 weeks for stable southerly winds. That delay matters. The balloon could not simply choose a route. It needed the right air. It needed a wind that could carry it north. On 11 July, the opportunity narrowed into a decision. A moderate breeze came from the south-southwest. At 1:46 in the afternoon, Ornen rose from Danes Island, with Andrée, Strindberg, and Frankel aboard. The failure began almost immediately. The balloon had never been test-flown. Within minutes of launch, the lower sections of all 3 guide ropes were lost. These ropes were not decoration. They were meant to drag below the balloon, adding friction and helping regulate height and direction. They were part of the system that gave André's balloon some claim to control. With the lower sections gone, Ornan became largely an uncontrollable free-flying balloon. That is the first break in the clean adventure version. The expedition did not fail only somewhere deep in the Arctic. Its main promise was damaged almost at once, while the launch was still fresh and observers were still close enough to understand that something had changed. But even this was not the final collapse. The common shorthand is that the balloon crashed. The record points to a slower defeat. Hydrogen escaped. Moisture gathered. Fog cooled the gas. Ice formed on the envelope and rigging. Weight increased as lifting force decreased. Buoyancy is the force that keeps a balloon aloft. Ornan did not lose it in one instant. It lost it over time until the basket had been striking and bouncing against the ice for many hours. Less than 3 days after launch, the balloon was forced down on the pack ice at 82 degrees, 56 minutes north, 29 degrees, 52 minutes east. The landing did not kill the men. That fact changes the shape of the disaster. After the balloon failed, the expedition became a survival march. They still had supplies. They still had tools. They still had notebooks. They still had the camera. Their problem had changed from flight to movement. And movement on sea ice is not movement on land. The men first aimed southeast toward Cape Flora. On a map, that sounds like a decision. On the ice, it was a contest. Ice drift is the movement of sea ice under wind and current, and the ice beneath the expedition had a substantial westerly element. They were walking, but the floor was moving. This is one of the central facts of the case. The men could spend strength, make distance, and still lose the larger argument. Their bodies moved across the ice moved beneath them. The route was not just hard, it was unstable. After about 2 weeks, they realized they could not overcome the drift. This was not a simple failure of effort. It was a failure of geometry, weather, current, and planning assumptions. The surface they had to cross was carrying them away from the goal their labor was trying to reach. The depot problem made the decision worse. The Seven Islands depot had not yet been laid when the expedition departed, and contemporaries understood that ice conditions made that journey difficult or impossible. The men were not moving through a clean rescue grid. They were moving through uncertain support, changing routes, and supplies that had to be dragged over ice that would not hold still. This is where the photographs become more than haunting images. They are evidence of a middle phase the simple story often erases. They show that the expedition after the balloon was not immediate panic. There was order. There was labor. There was documentation. There were loads, postures, arrangements, and pauses in which the camera was still used. A later Swedish research report, summarizing Tyrone Martinson's work, described an analysis of 93 previously unknown images and argued that the pictures contained important information about life on the ice. That point matters because the images are not just illustrations. They are part of the source base. But source base does not mean full answer. The photographs help reconstruct what the men did after the balloon came down. They show that the expedition remained organized enough to document itself. They help resist the easy version in which the landing is the end. They do not explain every choice. They do not show how each man judged the shifting route. They do not preserve what was said after the camera was put away. They do not name the final cause of death. The warning was not hidden. It had the shape of Niels Ekholm, a meteorologist from the earlier 1896 effort, leaving the expedition before the 1897 launch because of concern about gas leakage. It had the shape of a balloon that had never been test flown. It had the shape of fog, freezing moisture, and Arctic air pressing against a 30-day endurance claim that had already been questioned. This was the environmental signal inside the technical plan. The danger was not only that the balloon might break, the danger was that normal Arctic conditions could make its promises false. Fog did not need to be dramatic. It only needed to cool hydrogen and add moisture. Ice did not need to tear the balloon open. It only needed to add weight. Wind did not need to become a storm. It only needed to take direction away from men who had already lost the lower sections of their guide ropes. Gas retention became survival. Moisture became weight. Ice became loss of lift. Wind became not a route, but a command. The launch week record shows Andrée was not incapable of caution. Lachambre and Macheron recorded an earlier chance when he watched the instruments, saw the barometer falling too fast, and refused to go because he expected the favorable wind would not last. That matters because the case becomes weaker when Andrée is reduced to blind confidence. He could recognize some risk. He could delay. He could refuse an opportunity when the weather did not fit the plan. The sharper criticism is that the plan required too much cooperation from a place built out of change. By 11 July, the season was moving. The men had waited. The right wind seemed to appear. The decision that followed was not made in ignorance of weather, but inside a narrowing window where ambition, schedule, and environmental uncertainty pressed against each other. Once Ornan rose, the consequences became physical. Guide ropes were lost, control weakened, hydrogen leaked, moisture gathered, ice formed, lift diminished. The basket struck the ice, the balloon came down. Then the second expedition began. Not the public expedition of launch photographs, national expectation, and messages sent home. The second expedition was the one reconstructed from diaries, route analysis, recovered objects, and damaged film. It was slower, heavier, and less symbolic. It was 3 men hauling what remained of a failed flight across a moving surface. The outside world did not see that journey in real time. It had the pigeon message, then nothing. For decades, that nothing was filled with versions of the men that were easier to manage than the evidence would later be. The 1930 discovery did not simply solve that silence. It replaced silence with fragments. The Brattvåg party found the last camp on White Island. They found remains, diaries, equipment, and photographic film. The camp had to be read like a document, but not like a complete one. Its objects had positions, its diaries had words, its photographs had surfaces. Together, they destroyed some myths. They did not answer every final question. Before 1930, one could imagine almost anything. After 1930, one could not. The balloon had not flown on into the unknown. The men had landed on the ice. They had marched. They had changed plans. They had reached White Island. They had died there. Here is where the evidence narrows and then stops. It shows the launch from Danes Island. It shows the balloon losing control and lift. It shows the forced landing. It shows the attempt to move across drifting ice. It shows the change from flight to hauling. It shows the last camp on White Island. It does not show the final cause of death. That remains unclear. There was no neat courtroom verdict to close the file. No single formal judgment turned the expedition into a settled lesson. The aftermath was made of publication, commemoration, museum evidence, archival description, and later scholarship returning to the same materials. The Andrée case changed the story more than it changed a code. Later, polar flight moved toward powered airships and aircraft, but the record does not support a simple claim that Andrée directly caused that shift. The narrower conclusion is stronger. This balloon became a case study in the danger of treating weather as a servant of ambition. The photographs became central because they refused both easy versions. They refused the old celebratory version because they showed the expedition reduced to hauling and survival after the machine failed. They also refused the later ridicule because they showed discipline, order, and continued documentation inside that failure. The men in the recovered images were not symbols first. They were workers inside a collapsing plan. A load had to be moved, a route had to be chosen, a camp had to be arranged, a camera had to be set up. Evidence had to be made before anyone knew whether evidence would ever be found. That is what the images can prove. There was work after failure, order after the landing, and a record still being made after Ornan came down. That is also where they stop. They cannot prove the last conversation. They cannot prove the final decision. They cannot prove the cause of death. They cannot give the comfort of standing beside the men at the end. My read is that the photographs are most useful when they are treated as resistance to certainty. They keep the men visible, but they do not permit the comfort of pretending to know more than the record gives. That is the harder case White Island returned. Not a clean answer, not a simple moral, a sequence of evidence that grows sharper and then breaks off. Strindberg's camera began as part of the expedition's proof. If the men reached the pole or crossed the Arctic, the images would help carry that achievement home. Before departure, according to Lachambre and Macaron, Strindberg had even thought of photographs as something that might be sent back to Anna Charlier. By 1930, the camera carried a different proof. It proved the men had not disappeared in a single blank instant. It proved there had been work after failure. It proved that the expedition kept making a record after the balloon lost its purpose. It proved that the Arctic had not erased everything, but it did not prove the final answer. The last image should not be forced into a verdict. It is smaller than that and more exact. A photographer on the ice, a camera used in a failing expedition, men arranging themselves in their evidence while the world that might receive it remained impossibly far away. The last thing the expedition left was not a flag at the pole. It was a developed photograph. Three men still arranging evidence for a world they would never see again.